Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with me, Mr. Snyder. Today we are going to discuss the road to the Civil War, or some of the causes that caused our country to divide and fight one another. Learning targets. We'll talk about the growing conflict of slavery in the Western Territories. We'll explain how the Fugitive Slave Act and other events increase Northern opposition to slavery. And we'll talk about the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court and how that's kind of the point of no return. So the Missouri Compromise is passed in 1820 because we always have to add states two at a time, one north and one south. If one south is ready to come in and not a northern one, the northern people won't let it in because that will give the south more power. This compromise has three provisions, and it's between the pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions in the U.S. Congress. Maine is admitted as a free state, Missouri is admitted as a slave state, and then in the former Louisiana Territory, slavery is excluded north of the 3630 line. And let me show you a map of that. So here you can see all of the free states, all of the slave states, the 3630 Missouri Compromise line, and the unorganized territory. It's closed to slavery by the Missouri Compromise. So, except for Missouri itself, and then if you extend that line eastward, Kentucky, Virginia, etc. So after 25 years later, we're in the Mexican-American War, and we get a lot of land from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Texas Secession the Texas Secession from Mexico. So what's going to prevent slavery from being in those states for Northerners? So David Wilmot calls for a ban on slavery in any territory the U.S. gains from the Mexican-American War. And Southern leaders are outraged by this. There's no way they'll ever let this pass, but it does increase slavery tensions between the North and the South. So the supporters of the Wilmot Proviso, they get together, and out of the dust of it, they form the Free Soil Party, Northern opponents of slavery. Their main agenda is to prevent the expansion of slavery into the Western Territories, and they even get a presidential candidate nominated in 1848, former President Martin Van Buren, but he loses. And then finally we get to 30 years later from the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, which really throws a wrench into the gears of this nation working. So California enters as a free state in 1850. Another few more provisions of this compromise is that slavery in the territories would be decided by popular sovereignty. And we've talked about that concept before, but basically it means that voters would decide the issues for themselves. Each state would have a vote on whether or not they would allow slavery. And this also passes a newer, stricter Fugitive Slave Act. It makes people arrested for being a runaway slave denied a jury trial, and also forces Northern citizens to capture runaways. So if people in the North know that a runaway slave is near them, they are forced to report it or even capture them and return the property to the Southern owners, because the government can't take away property rights, and slave or property. So the North resists this by passing personal liberty laws that go against the Fugitive Slave Act and actually arrest known slave catchers that are trying to do their job in the northern states. They could be arrested for trying to capture fugitive slaves. So what the Compromise of 1850 does is it basically indirectly nullifies the Missouri Compromise, because it does permit slavery in the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory that we get in the Mexican-American War Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Uncle Tom's Cabin. This isn't in the learning targets, but it is kind of important. Harriet Beecher Stowe is the author of this, and she writes this novel to condemn slavery. And it's the best-selling novel of the 1800s. I have a copy of it if you'd like to look. But it basically lets Northerners see slavery firsthand, because they don't experience it. They only hear things about it. They read it, and they finally go, whoa, this is some pretty harsh stuff that they're doing to these people. Why do we allow this? Basically, one time, Stowe goes to the White House and meets President Lincoln, and President Lincoln says to her, "So you are the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." Then in 1854, the next step on the way to war is the KansasNebraska Act. And basically, Stephen Douglas, senator for Illinois, introduces legislation for Nebraska to enter as a free state. Of course, they don't like this, so we need to add another slave state, so we divide the bill into two states, Kansas and Nebraska. Both states would decide slavery by popular sovereignty. So both pro and anti-slavery people flock to Kansas, trying to outnumber the others. So people are moving there in order to get Kansas. They try to make it a slave state, or they try not to make it a slave state. They each set up their own governments. Violence erupts between the two groups. John Brown, a anti-slavery New Yorker, brutally murders 5 pro-slavery settlers with a hacksaw. Him and his sons murder them. There's so much violence along the Kansas-Nebraska border that the situation becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. Finally, when the Civil War starts, Kansas enters the Union as a free state. And here you can see where Bleeding Kansas is taking place. It would have made Kansas and Nebraska 2 different states, and it's taking place right along that line. So the opposition to slavery and the failure of the Free Soil Party leads to the creation of the new Republican Party in 1854, and they quickly surpassed the Whigs as the main opposition to the Democrats, and that's how it remains today, Republicans and Democrats. In the election of 1856, Buchanan, the Democrat, wins, but the Republican Party takes 11 of the northern states, vote for John Fremont. And so they do have some power. They are the main opposition to the Democrats. Finally, we get to the Dred Scott decision. There's no need to write this down, but Dred Scott is a slave in Missouri, but from 1833 to 43, he resides in Illinois and in an area of the Louisiana Territory, both where slavery is forbidden. After returning back to Missouri, Scott sues unsuccessfully in the Missouri courts for his freedom, claiming that since he lived in a free territory, that made him a free man. He then brings suit in a federal court. Scott's master maintains that no pure-blooded Negro of African descent and the descendant of slaves could be a citizen of the United States and could even bring suit before a court. So the question before the Supreme Court is Scott a slave? And here's what the Supreme Court says. Slaves are property, not citizens, and therefore cannot bring suit in a court of law. It also upholds the property rights of Sanford, saying that he's not a free man just because he traveled in free states with his master. He remains a slave. And then it goes and is even more far-reaching because it says that Congress in 1820 did not have the power to outlaw slavery in any territory because it deprives a citizen of their property without due process or without going through the courts. So this officially makes the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, and this is kind of the turning point, or the point of no return here before the Civil War. We are going to have to fight this out. Southerners are overjoyed with the Scott decision, but the Northerners are fearful of it. They're alarmed by it. It's the tipping point towards civil war. And then finally, in 1858, we have the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, 2 powerful politicians, are running for the Senate seat in Illinois. And Lincoln's view on slavery, he doesn't call for the immediate end of slavery or even political equality for African Americans. Douglas's view on slavery is he's a proponent of popular sovereignty. Let each state vote for themselves. And Douglas will win the Senate race, but Lincoln gets a lot of good publicity from this, and it will gear him up for a presidential run in 1860. And finally, John Brown, the man who hacked those people to death, feels violence is the answer. So him and his followers seize a military arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. and he's going to get slaves to join his revolt. He's going to arm them with this military. Unfortunately, no slaves joined. He's captured by U.S. Colonel Robert E. Lee, put on trial for treason and murder, and sentenced to death. And Brown, he's a hero to abolitionists everywhere, but he's also a crazy person, according to the South. It inflames Southern anger and suspicion about what the North wants to do for slavery. And that is all I have for you today. Fill out your learning targets, bring your questions to class, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.